Welcome to this Nexa video, where you will learn how to create and manage users and groups, and how to assign permissions to both. You will need admin permissions to be able to perform these actions. Let's start from the Nexa desktop. Clicking on this item, I have access to all its details on the right-hand side pane. Today we are going to focus on the item permissions. As you can see, specific permissions have been granted to groups and to users for this item. Groups can have read, write, delete and notify permissions, meaning that every user belonging to a group will inherit these permissions. In addition, single users can be granted additional permissions on top of the ones they inherit from groups. Today's goal is to create a brand new group in Nexa for the Research and Development Department, whose users will manage the engineering projects of the company. Then we will create a new user, assign it to the newly created R&D group, assign the user's permissions and briefly touch upon the user's screen permissions. The purchasing department will also need read access to the engineering projects, although there are occasions where a specific user from purchasing is granted extra write permissions. We will see how to implement and manage these requirements in Nexa. We will also see how to modify the group and the user's attributes, and we will create a new engineering project item and touch firsthand the effect of all the above actions. First of all, I log into Nexa as the admin user Emma Blesh, who will create the required users and groups. This user has access to the administration menu. When I select Users, Nexa shows me in the central pane a list of the available users. If I click on one of the names, the right-hand side pane will show all the actual properties of the user. From each tab, I can modify the properties of the user: details, screen permissions, groups, classes, status. I right-click on one of the users and the context menu shows me 4 options: Add, Copy, Delete and Save. If I click on Add, the Add User window opens. There are 3 required fields to be filled in: the login name, the username and the password. This password is provisional. The user will have to change it at the first login. Here I can fill out the fields with telephone, extension and email. I can also decide to grant admin privileges to the user by flagging the DBA enabled box. The box Disable allows the administrator to temporarily render the user inactive, meaning that the user is still in the database, but it cannot perform any action. Nexa provides a great degree of flexibility, and one can keep on personalizing the user by going on to the Screen Permission and Groups tabs before saving, or equivalently, these properties can also be personalized after the creation of the user. I decide to follow this second route, so I click on Save. We will discuss later the importance of the screen permissions. At this point, I select the Groups tab, where I can add the user to one or more existing groups. The Classes tab provides a reminder of the permissions the user has. For example, if the user has been granted permission to read and write items of a specific class, these permissions will be shown in the upper part of the right pane. If the permissions stem from belonging to a group, they appear in the bottom part of the pane. We cover how to add specific user permissions later in this video. The Status tab contains reminders of the current activities. Since we have just created this user, there is nothing here now. At this point I want to create a new group for the R&D department. From Administration Groups, I right-click on one group. The context menu allows me to add, copy, delete and save. I select Add and the new window opens. At the top I can add the group name. Since a group is just a set of users, all I have to do is to assign members to it. I assign a couple of users, including the newly created user Paul Moll. Finally, I'll click on Save. This adds the new group to the database and closes this dialog. Now I need to ensure that the users belonging to the R&D group have read and write permissions on all the future engineering projects of the company. To assign these permissions, I select Classes from the Administration menu, and Nexa shows me a list of available classes in the central pane. I browse until I find the Engineering Project class, and I click on it. In the right-hand pane, I click on Group Access. Here, I am able to assign default group permissions for any existing group. In particular, I assigned read and write permissions to the newly created R&D group. Notice that the Purchasing group has only read permissions by default. Let's keep this in mind because we are going to use this piece of information in a few moments. Let's log in as the newly created R&D member, Paul Moll, who will add a new engineering project item. All I need to do is to click New at the top left and select Project. I notice though that the New button is grayed out, meaning that I do not have permission to use this functionality. The admin has to grant the so-called screen permissions to my user for this functionality to be available. Think of the screen permissions as the ability to perform actions. In this case, the action I need to perform is to add a new project and modify its permissions. We will provide a more detailed explanation of the screen permissions in a dedicated video. Today, the admin is going to quickly add the correct screen permissions to the user Paul Moll. The admin clicks Users from the administration menu, and after having selected the user Paul Moll, she modifies the user by adding the appropriate screen permissions. In this case, she will copy the screen permissions from another user. Now Paul Moll has screen permissions to add new projects. Let's log back in as Paul Moll. The New button is now available for a new project. This window allows me to input the necessary information for the new engineering project. First of all, I select the correct class for the item I want to create by simply browsing the class structure. After adding the PLM attributes for this new engineering project, such as name, title, and description, I open the Permissions tab. Here I can visualize all the group and user permissions that are assigned by default to new engineering projects. As you can see, the R&D group has been automatically assigned read and write permissions, while the purchasing group has read permissions only. It is important to know that users with the correct screen permissions have the ability to override the default permissions for groups and users when they add or alter files and projects, or even when they check in items into Nexa. Having said that, as I am adding this new item, and as I was granted the correct screen permissions to modify the project permissions, I am able to assign extra write permissions to either the purchasing group or even only to a specific user belonging to the purchasing group. As I want to grant this write permission only to the user Ines Dubois from the purchasing group, I will leave the group permissions untouched and just add it to the single user. The user Ines Dubois will need write permissions for this specific engineering project item to be able to update the information about the cost and the approved manufacturer. Notice that even if I remove read from the user permissions of the user Ines Dubois for this item, she would still continue to inherit the read permission from the purchasing group. In other words, users inherit all the permissions from all the groups they belong to on top of their own user permissions. In order to best manage permissions, it is highly recommended that class permissions are assigned to groups and that users inherit those permissions from the groups they belong to. In this way, it will be much easier to manage user permissions by managing group permissions. I now click on Save and the engineering project item is created. Finally, let's have a look at all the engineering projects in this Nexa instance to verify the read and write permissions of my user. If I click on Classes in the top menu and I browse to the engineering project class, Nexa displays the items belonging to this class. As you can see, all the engineering projects that were added to Nexa before I granted read and write access to the R&D group are not accessible for my user, who belongs to the R&D group. Only the engineering project that has been created afterwards can be visualized and opened. To conclude this video, let's log out and log back in as Ines Dubois, the member of the purchasing group. If I browse to the engineering project class, I see that I generally have only read permissions. As you can see, if I click on Checkout, Nexa alerts me that I do not have write permissions for this item. Nevertheless, if I select the newly created engineering project, I notice that I have extra write permissions, as I am actually able to check it out and modify the PLM attributes. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notifications so that you don't miss all the upcoming Nexa videos with new tutorials and feature updates. Thanks for watching.